We made this.
Welcome to the Starlight Ballroom. Hey!
Hello and welcome to Shipwrecked and Comatose, the podcast about Red Dwarf on the We Made This podcast network. My name's Mark Adams and I am your host for this special episode in between Series X and Series 11. And we're doing one of our tenuous links. And, well, I've recruited someone for this tenuous link that's becoming a semi-regular on the show. Welcome back, Rob Turnbull.
Thank you very much. I feel like I myself have a tenuous link.
Yeah, you're the host of You Have Been Watching, which is a podcast about sitcoms. And we're looking at a sitcom today. Or rather, a sitcom pilot that failed and didn't get commissioned.
Yes. I wonder why.
Well, we're looking at Mama's Back. And the reason we're looking at Mama's Back is it is directed by legendary Red Dwarf director Ed Bye. And full disclosure, I'm a bit rubbish at kind of spotting directory shit, so you might have to help me on this one, Rob.
By all means. He tells the actors where to go, asks them to say words when it's time to say words, and make sure the camera's there. That's kind of what he does.
Well, yes, thanks. I meant I'm not very good at spotting good or bad directing, so...
Okay.
I don't have any strong opinions on Mama's Back's directing, but I do have some strong opinions on Mama's Back.
Yeah, I've definitely got opinions on it.
Well, for the listeners, if you've not watched it, it is available for free on YouTube. Don't know how legal that is, but that's how I accessed it. I watched it on YouTube. Terrible, grainy copy of it. And by the time you listen to this, it will be on our socials for you to have a watch if you want to pause the pod and watch it first. I would recommend that you maybe watch it. Would you recommend that they watch it, Rob?
You know what? It's so short. It's like, why not? Why not? If you've got, I mean, it's barely half an hour.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would recommend people watch this. I mean, I know we're about to get into it in a bit more detail, but maybe I'll come back to whether I would recommend it. I would probably recommend it under certain circumstances.
Yeah, but if you want to know what the hell we're talking about, get it watched. Basically, it's only half an hour. So, Mama's Back was released in 1993, and this is what Ed Bye was doing when he wasn't directing Series 6 of Red Dwarf. Yeah. Do we think he made the right choice?
I mean, I would say for the sake of his marriage, he probably made the right choice.
Oh, yes, it was written by Ruby
Turning
Wax.
this down might not have been a good choice.
And, yeah, it was written by his wife, Ruby Wax, and it was on BBC One. So, you know, it was given a good chance putting it on the main channel.
I actually remember it at the time. There was quite a big push for it because obviously Joan Collins was, I mean, the sort of the meta element of it, the Mama's Back part, you know, Joan Collins playing an actor who is coming back to the UK under a cloud in this in this context. But it was like Joan Collins was coming back to the UK and doing BBC One. There was a bit of buzz around it. They were definitely pushing it. You know, Ruby Wax was probably at the height of her bankability, I guess, in the sort of early 90s.
And that's the thing. When you look at it on paper, Ruby Wax wrote it. Ed Bye directed it. Joan Collins was the main star, and the supporting actors were Michael Gambon, Rupert Everett, Clive James, and Samantha Janus. That's British telly royalty right there.
It's such a bizarre little thing. And also it's worth noting that Jennifer Saunders was the script editor.
I didn't clock that. Jennifer Saunders was involved as well.
Yeah, well, because Ruby Wax had been the script editor on Absolutely Fabulous, and so she kind of, you know, returned the favour on this. So, like you say, on paper, there's so much there. Also, one of the other cast members was Dana Ivey, American actor, really funny American actor. It's not like Betty White, but it was like a little bit of like, you know, an American, you know, Hollywood comedy performer in there. So yeah, it's like, it's a real high caliber production.
And they clearly invested time and effort into it. But
yeah.
Okay, so full disclosure. As I was watching it, I was writing down whether or not I'd had any laughs after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and 25 minutes. So we'll get back to that as we go through the general chat about it. I'm not going to say the plot line as it happened. I'm just going to bring up some points to talk about. And I'd like to talk about the theme tune first. I was expecting campery because it's got Joan Collins as the main character, and it wasn't camp at all.
No, and it's like, without jumping ahead, because I don't want to jump ahead, but the whole thing, particularly towards the end, I can't decide whether Wax was trying to write something comedy drama-esque, or maybe it's just that the writing wasn't very funny, but it's shot single camera on film. It's not an audience sitcom. This was not usual for then. So the whole thing is like, it's almost like they are trying to do something a little bit different. And what is, I guess almost disappointing is that Collins is actually playing it really straight.
Yeah.
Like she plays it really straight, with the exception, I would say, of the very opening scene, which I think actually fair. Jars. The opening scene, I don't think works with the rest of the tone. The opening scene and the very closing gag actually are like they're in two different sitcoms. And then everything else in the middle is, like I say, Collins really plays it straight.
That's interesting that you talk about the opening scene, though. That is a role that I could definitely have seen Joan Collins in. And I think, to some extent, we've got to acknowledge that she was being a really good sport here. Before stuff like Episodes and other sitcoms where people have played comedic, kind of exaggerated, borderline ridiculous versions of themselves. Okay, this isn't Joan Collins playing Joan Collins, but it's Joan Collins playing a Joan Collins alike.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. If they were making this show now, she would be playing herself.
Yes.
It would be like that Snickers advert where the guy is Joan Collins being a diva. That's a great gag, and it's Joan Collins being a good sport. The idea that, what's the ultimate diva? Oh, it's Joan Collins. But here, it's like, she's playing, like you say, a Joan Collins alike, but the diva-y part is only really in that opening scene. And then it's almost dry. I don't know whether she was, like, she is being a good sport, and I think she is a good sport when you look at other stuff that she's done, definitely. But it's really weird how, I don't know whether perhaps she wanted to approach it as a bit more straight. Whether she was coming in and she's like, you know what, I don't want to be camp. Like, I'll do this, but it's hard to tell, it's like it's 30 years, isn't it? It's like, it's hard to tell where she was coming from in terms of doing this, but it's such a weird, tonally all over the place. Yeah.
And I think had it stuck with the tone of the campery at the beginning, even though the theme tune wasn't camp, I think it would have probably been a stronger show.
I think so, yeah.
I think to some extent it's before its time, but the problem with it being before its time is it didn't quite hit right. It didn't quite get the tone right. It didn't quite get the ideas crisp. And I think this would actually be a better idea for a show now.
I think this is the problem, isn't it? With stuff which is before its time, sometimes you get something which is before its time, it's ahead of the game, and it just nails it. And you watch back with hindsight and you go, wow, this show was doing this 15 years before anyone else. Sometimes you get a show like this where you go, it wasn't good enough. Other people have now come along and done that better.
Yeah.
And that's the reality. The other thing as well is that even at the time, this was very immediately compared to Absolutely Fabulous. Because Ab Fab had launched the previous year and had just huge, took off straight away. This is kind of like laugh track free single camera Ab Fab. It's very Ab Fab adjacent.
Yeah.
And that probably didn't help the fact that it came so hot on the tails of Absolutely Fabulous that you kind of go, well, this is just Absolutely Fabulous, but a little bit straighter and not as funny.
Like I say, it is incongruous, the starting. A diva-like character gets their comeuppance, and that's played for laughs. That's around the 5-minute mark. No laughs for me yet. It was played for laughs, but it didn't make me laugh. And I think if they'd have been more kind of daft with her and made her less sympathetic as it went along, that would have fitted the first few scenes. But she wasn't sympathetic at all to begin with. And then they kind of dropped that idea and made her kind of likable and fragile and really quite compelling as a character in a strange way, I thought.
This is the crazy thing, and you're exactly right. They needed to do one of two things. They needed to basically, after that first scene, you know, once she comes back to the UK, you know, and has left America, where you've just got Kevin McNally is doing a bad American accent, you know, once she's come back to the UK, she needed to continue to be an arsehole. She needed to be a diva. She needed to be awful and obnoxious. But she's not. She's actually, like you say, she's quite vulnerable and quite compelling. So what we needed was that opening scene. Instead of her being fired, it needed to be her saying, I can't do this anymore. I can't be this person. And, you know, pulling her wig off in that opening scene and saying, I need to go home to my family. That would have had some consistency. Because also it's worth noting that, like, Michael Gambon, when he arrives, he literally bursts into the scene shouting, and he plays the whole thing at 11. Like, he is right. He is playing the high camp version of this. And then you've got Michael Gambon versus Joan Collins, and it's like, Joan Collins is the subtle, nuanced performance in this scene. It's crazy.
She's perfect for the role, and she starts almost in a Britass way that you're just fundamentally unlikable, even though you don't realise it. And that is a good idea for a main character in a sitcom. And the problem is, I think the riches to rags story is really tough to tell, and they don't really know how to tell it.
So, like I say, I watched it back in the day. My memory of it was being longer. I don't know why. In my head, this was an hour long.
Right.
And then I went back to it and I was like, oh no, it really is just like a half-hour sitcom, which, you know, but I mean, I don't think I have watched it in the last 30 years. You know, I watched it when it was on. So I watched it a couple of times in prep for this. And when I was making notes, one of the things that I couldn't get over was the fact that, yeah, it is this kind of like riches to rags story, but there's no reason for that. It's like she gets off the plane in the UK and they're like, we can't afford a limo to take you home. We have to get in a regular black cab. And it's like, okay, but were her finances so fragile that she quits one? And there's a reference to the fact that, you know, oh, no studio will touch her and all this kind of stuff. It's like, but it's not enough.
She'd still have lots of money left.
Yeah, she should just have a shit ton of money.
Yeah, and I think you look at this, and then you look at the subtlety and the intelligence of something like Schitt's Creek, and it's miles behind.
Watching this back, you know, not to hark on from the first time, when I watched it when I was like, whatever I was, a young teenager, I just watched it and was like, this isn't very good. And then they never made any more episodes and I barely thought about it. Watching it again now, a slightly more critical mind, bit older, I'm kind of like looking at what is wrong with it.
Yeah.
And the irony is that the script is just really, really bad. And considering it's Ruby Wax, who I think the evidence is there that Ruby Wax was a good script editor on other projects. And the evidence is there that Jennifer Saunders was a good script writer on other projects. But these two, you know, with those sort of roles reversed, the script is just such a mess and just needed tightening and pulling back together. They're constantly reiterating information about her that we know, and it's only 30 minutes long.
Yeah.
We're constantly getting information reiterated, but we're not really learning anything. And there's no nuance to it. And like you say, you know, Schitt's Creek is like, that's such a sophisticated riches to rags to riches story. Obviously, they got their umpteen seasons. This only got a pilot. And to be fair, this screams pilot. Like, all they're doing is telling us who people are. But even then, it's like, it's not good enough. A pilot still needs to do more than just tell you who the characters are.
Yeah. We'll talk about the Winnie Mandela thing. I mean, I'm not in the demographic to really be able to talk about the experience or how one feels about that particular prejudice. I don't feel like it's actively and certainly not deliberately racist. It's a bit ignorant and it's a bit cringy. And the problem is it isn't funny. That's the biggest thing.
That is the problem. It's not a funny joke. I think that the idea behind it, I don't think it's inherently racist. And especially because the idea that she's played all these historical figures, and they list off all these many, clearly, obviously white people. And then somebody else says, oh, I loved you as Winnie Mandela. I think that's fine as a punchline if you're going to throw that in, because obviously she's not played Winnie Mandela. Or if she has played Winnie Mandela, that's hugely offensive, and it helps to highlight that she's an awful person.
Yeah.
But they don't. What she does is she then says, oh, did I play Winnie Mandela? I can't remember. Rupert Everett goes, no, Winnie Mandela's black. And then she goes, oh, well, do the studio know? And it's such shit. It's really, really bad, middle-aged New York stand-up kind of comedy. I have a soft spot for Ruby Wax. I like Ruby Wax. I think that she has and can be funny and insightful, but so much of this comedy just feels like bad middle-aged New York stand-up, and that's the problem with that. Especially there's a callback to the Winnie Mandela gag at the end, just to remind you about this shitty joke. Yeah,
we'll talk about that at the end. Because I have very strong opinions about the final gag.
Yeah,
but we're about 10 minutes in now, and the vast majority of the characters have been unlikable, and that's okay for something like Britas, but there are some likeable characters in Britas, or at least some sympathetic characters. And you've got the 80s and 90s marriage stereotype of two people who hate each other, resent each other's success, but stay together anyway. And again, I've seen it done better.
Yeah, well, again, a year before this, Absolutely Fabulous did it better. I'm not the world's biggest Absolutely Fabulous fan, but because that stays in that slightly kind of post-80s new wave comedy kind of surrealism, just that little edge of surrealism to something like Ab Fab, they also get away with tropes. When you're being a little bit hyper real, a little bit hyper silly, and you throw in a trope, you can it glosses over a bit more. When you've got Joan Collins, acting super straight and serious, and you've got Michael Gambon, he's still Michael Gambon, even when he's chewing the scenery, and they're just doing she's a bitch, all this kind of stuff. It's so tedious. And again, the dialogue is so, just almost dull, unfunny.
It's not that it's unfunny, it just comes across as quite tragic. Everything's quite sad, and you can have tragic stuff in comedy, obviously, but this just comes across as really, really sad in a lot of ways. And I think we've got to 10 minutes, no laughs, and it's around that point that you meet David, and he's really likeable. He's the first character that's really likeable. But he's tragic as well. And even the likeable character hasn't got a nice life, and it doesn't feel like they've got a good idea of what they want to be, and they've thrown shit at the wall. And rather than redraft, they've just gone, woo, Ruby Wax has done a script, let's go.
Absolutely. That's absolutely what it feels like. The whole thing, personally, I think it needed to be a little bit more surreal, but it needed that aggression. When you've got Joan Collins coming in and she is sort of acting seriously, pretty much, acting straight, and you've got Michael Gambon, being an arsehole to her, and then she goes and talks to her son David, and he's just like, oh, well, I haven't seen you for a long time, Mum. It's nice to see you back. And she makes him a sandwich in this very unfunny but slightly touching scene. It's like,
yes,
if Joan Collins had burst in screeching and screaming and throwing things around, and she and Gambon had a big kind of nose to nose bitching fight, that would be fine. That would be okay. It's like, oh, here we go. We've got this, it's the Tim Burton. it's the Richard Burton, relationship going on. It's fine. But it's not that. It's kind of one very aggressive, resentful man, one unloved son, and then a woman who just seems lost. It's so all over.
Right. We've seen Joan Collins have a fight with sequins in Dynasty. She can do campery comedy, even though that probably wasn't deliberate. Honestly, YouTube the sequin fight. It is one of the best thing that's happened in telly ever. It's these two middle-aged women arguing and then chucking sequins at each other. It's as brilliant as it sounds. Why were there no fucking sequins? They could have parodied that. There's just nothing here that really plays to the strength of Joan Collins. She's trying too hard because I think she identifies with the character more than she would like to. And I think later on, the scenes with the lack of makeup, we'll talk about that later, but I think maybe that is why she's being so serious with the role rather than campy.
I think you're right. I think that the problem is that the script itself, and it's hard to know at what point did the script change during production, or was this always the script? Did Joan Collins just interpret things a certain way? I think that the script doesn't allow for that sort of high camp, that over the top screeching kind of performance that we might have wanted. And it's hard to say whether that was ever written in there, but it just doesn't have that. It's not there. So Joan Collins doesn't deliver that. And like we keep saying, she plays it very straight and quite sensitively, to the point that actually it didn't need to be Joan Collins. The initial joke of it being Joan Collins, big American, TV diva from the UK coming back to England. It's like suddenly it actually could have been any actor playing that role because we're not utilising the Joan Collins-ness of her.
Yes, and you wonder whether that was deliberate to try and give it something new, something different, a challenge for Joan, for example. But it's a poor choice.
I do think, and I'm saying this with hindsight because I don't remember at the time, but I do feel like they are attempting to do a sort of a different style sitcom. It's like we both just said, ahead of its time, ahead of the game, this kind of thing. I think they're trying to do a slightly more poignant, slightly more dramatic single camera sitcom, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's just the writing's just not good enough, and it's not there. It's not there yet. Yeah. There's also the joke with her having these kind of various different ethnic children that she has adopted. And it's one of those weird things. It's like I get the joke, but there's no teeth to it. If you really want to satirize these kind of rich people who adopt children as accessories, then it needs to have some teeth. It needs to have some aggression to it. Whereas it actually just seems like she does sort of care about them and just forgotten their name. It's just, there's no oomph there.
No.
And so the joke not only falls flat, it feels a bit gross.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Because there's no satire to it. The show doesn't manage to satirize her. It doesn't manage to satirize the kind of the Madonnas of the world, which is what it needed to do. Instead, it just has this strange group of ethnically diverse children who seem to hang on her every word. And there's no real idea of what their relationship is. It's like, are they accessories? Does she really care about them? Do they really? It's just clunky. It's like I say, the whole thing feels like a first draft.
I couldn't agree more. It feels like it doesn't know what it wants to be. Does it want to be satire? Because it doesn't do a very good job at that. Does it want to be tragic? It doesn't really do a very good job of that. Does it want to be funny? It doesn't do a very good job of that. And 15 minutes in, no laughs.
Yeah.
This is the theme, as you may have noticed. Are we going to get a laugh by the end of the sitcom?
So I'm looking at my notes, and so far, I don't see any notes of me having laughed yet.
Right.
No.
Very brief thing to mention, the American accents are wretched. Absolutely wretched. No one gets their accent right. You can't get away with that now, but maybe at the time, a vague accent that sounded something like an American was okay.
I can't decide whether that is deliberate or not, whether it's that the production doesn't care or whether it's a little bit of a... Again, if you watch... sorry, I know I keep comparing it to Absolutely Fabulous, but I guess it's... In terms of similarities and sort of time frame, they're pretty close. There are some pretty bad American accents in Absolutely Fabulous, but I think it's deliberate.
And Absolutely Fab can get away with it.
I think there's that deliberate kind of oh, hey there, honey, I'm an American, ha ha ha. In this, I don't know whether it is a joke or whether they just... Because also I think some of the actors in it doing American accents have done better American accents in other things since. It's another thing that leaves you confused over what it's trying to be.
Yeah. And talking about that, I'm going to give you an example of something that, I don't know, maybe I've got old and too fucking woke, but maybe humour in actual cruelty to another human being is lost on me these days because I just don't find that kind of thing funny anymore. Maybe to some extent this was funnier to a 90s audience. And when he says one too many birthdays to her and she whimpers and runs out the room, that actually genuinely upset me. I thought that was fucking horrible. That's someone just genuinely being cruel to another human being. And I don't know, was her whimper supposed to be funny? Because it really did bother me, actually.
But I think that comes back to the same thing that we keep criticising this for, is the fact of the tone and the performance. Because again, I think if he had said, you know, oh, one too many birthdays, and she'd done a big dramatic kind of like, and run out like she was trying to get attention.
Yes.
That could have been funnier. It's, you know, and again, it's their sort of like toxic banter, and you could have gone with it. But yeah, I think it is that slight vulnerability. It's like, that is a cruel thing. It's like, and so are we meant to find it funny? And maybe on paper, maybe in the script, maybe at the table read, it was a lot funnier. And then once Joan gets into the setting, she's like, well, maybe I'll do it small. We may never know. But again, it's the kind of gag you could see that sort of gag in Absolutely Fabulous. You could see Safi saying, oh, one too many birthdays, and Jennifer Saunders just going and running out.
And that would have been funny.
Exactly.
And it would still be funny to 2024 woke me as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's because that show knew what it wanted to be. Even when it gets things wrong, even when it has, you know, stuff which isn't funny anymore, that show had an identity, which this just doesn't quite.
And don't get me wrong, I understand the context of something made in 1993. Trust me, I've done however many episodes of Red Dwarf, and I do have a nostalgia, not to the extent perhaps you do as the host of a sitcoms podcast, but, you know, I've watched episodes from a similar time of Only Fools and Horses where Del Boy, the main character, the good guy, makes back to the wall jokes about gay people. And there's an episode of fucking Hyacinth, Keeping Up Appearances, where the gag at the end is she gets sexually assaulted. She's locked in a car with the handsy bloke and runs away screaming as everybody laughs. That's worse than this. That is unforgivable. Disgraceful and disgusting that was ever played for laughs. But that was clearly played for laughs because you heard the laugh track over it. This whimper, I'm not sure if it was played for laughs. And if it wasn't, then why the fucking hell was it in there anyway? Because it was upsetting.
That's part of the problem with this, the ahead of its time not quite being there yet, is that certain sitcoms, and that Hyacinth Bouquet is a brilliant example, because that sitcom is a weird one. It's like, there's a lot of farce. It could be very funny, and then it can have stuff exactly like that. Stuff which is very cruel. It's like, Hyacinth doesn't deserve to be sexually assaulted just because she's irritating. No. But that's what we're presented with. But, like you say, the laugh track lets us know that it is funny. In a weird way, it lets us know that it's safe, if that's not a perverse way to think of it. Whereas with this, there is nothing to let us know that it's safe. There's no audience laughing. There's no giggle. There's no moment of going, oh, okay, she's all right. She's not really upset. She's goofing. She's trying to make him feel bad because the audience are having a good laugh. There's nothing like that. So we're left entirely to decide ourselves. And I suspect this is one of the reasons that it wasn't a success at the time. Not just because it's not very funny and there's no point pretending that it is funnier than it is. But I think also because it's just, people didn't know how to react to it. It's like, and especially after pretty much the halfway point, it's almost like it stops even trying to be funny.
Yes. And, you know, okay, something I did like. Clive James playing Clive James.
Yeah.
Lovely. I like Clive James. I always enjoyed his show. We are sad that he's no longer with us. And that was a nice little thing. And he played a very good Clive James. That worked. That genuinely worked. And I think he's friends with Ruby Wax, if I'm right.
I think Ruby Wax used to write on his... he had a show on ITV? I think Ruby Wax used to write.
Well, there you go. So I knew there was a connection. And that's nice, that. She got a mate in, and that actually really worked. That was actually quite fun. A really nice idea. But 20 minutes in, no laughs. Yeah. Were you a fan of Clive James?
I could take him or leave him. If he had guests on that I was interested in, I would watch it, and his presence didn't offend me. But I did always find him a bit smug.
Oh, I kind of
and some of his delivery of his jokes were a bit a bit cheesy for me. So I was a bit more take him or leave him.
Fair.
If he had someone like Dame Edna on, that was always a good show.
Yeah. I mean, he was essentially the Graham Norton of his time, wasn't he? He had such strong guests every fucking time.
Yeah, that's not a bad one, actually. Yeah, because it's like, it was a strange time as well, actually, when he was most prolific as a chat show host, was that weird kind of, it was post-Parkinson, but it was kind of pre-mainstream Jonathan Ross and absolutely pre-Graham Norton.
Yeah.
So it was a weird time that he kind of, this might sound like a backhanded compliment, but there was less competition. You know, sort of like him and Wogan, and obviously Wogan was very kind of like tea time.
Yes.
You know, family friendly. So Clive James had a bit more edge to him.
Yes, exactly.
It was a bit grungier. Yeah.
At this point as well, very briefly, just something you absolutely wouldn't see on television these days, but you do see on Red Dwarf, is someone smoking a cigarette. Dates it, doesn't it?
Oh my God. Well, it's like Gambon's character is basically just finishes one, lights up another. It's crazy how it dates stuff. And I think we've hit a point now where we've gone so long without seeing casual smoking in contemporary comedy and drama that we really notice it now.
Yeah. Exactly.
And also to the extent that when you're trying to establish that something is set in the past, one of the best ways to do it is having someone with a cigarette.
Yeah, I suppose so. And then I've called it the Faces montage. I don't even know what I want to say about this. It's different and it's interesting, but I don't think it worked.
It doesn't work at all. And there's a couple of reasons for me I think it doesn't work. But I will say, going back to the Ed By stuff, it's very Ed By.
Okay.
That feels very, very Ed By. That kind of like camera POV with people leaning in. That's something that I feel that sort of crops up in other stuff that he does. It feels very Ed By in that moment. But it's not very funny. I get the joke. It's the idea that all these people are like fussing around her to make her look beautiful and all this kind of thing. But that Faces montage just goes on too long.
Yes.
It's just really, 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 really long when it needed to be like 15, 20 seconds. And the other thing is, at the end of it, she doesn't really she looks amazing beforehand. She looks amazing afterwards. All they've really done is poofed her hair up and put her in a dress. Well, there was no real contrast. It's not like she'd hit rock bottom and wasn't looking after herself and had to bring her back. It's this whole gag about how much work it takes to make her look screen ready, and it lasts too long and she doesn't look much different.
She does look fucking stunning though. I mean, that final image at the end of it, you're like, that's Joan Collins. That's how I see Joan Collins. That's Dynasty Joan Collins. And I think it's maybe the reason why she was cast was just for that image of how glamorous she is with the hair and the dress and stuff. At that point around, again, it's just after the 20-minute mark, isn't it?
You can't underestimate the importance of her playing the role. As much as I feel like they didn't utilize her being in it, it was very much about the image. It was about having Joan Collins in there. And it is sort of similar to how Extras worked a few years ago, where a big part of it was, we've got Samuel L. Jackson is in this episode. We've got Kate Winslet is in this episode. It was very much about having them in it. how much they're involved with it, how funny they are, wasn't that pertinent, wasn't that relevant, but it was about the icon that was that actor. And that's absolutely what it was with Joan Collins. And again, hadn't really been done that much. Especially because we think of these kind of British actors that leave us and go to America and become huge in America. At that point in particular, we never thought they would come back. So the idea of her coming back and doing stuff. Now, the sort of transatlantic movement of actors is completely different. Everyone's all over the place. It's a global society. Everything's wonderful. But back then, it's kind of like, wow, Joan Collins is back in the UK and look at her. She looks like Joan Collins. It's amazing. And that was a huge, huge selling point for this, but wasn't enough. It just proved not to be enough to pin the whole thing on, unfortunately.
No. And then there is the stupid cow joke at 21:54, and to my shame, this was my first laugh. I felt guilty afterwards, if that helps.
That's all right. It's like you're allowed a little chuckle at some low-key misogyny.
But this is a sitcom. This is a sitcom. And at 21:54 of a 28-minute sitcom episode, this is my only actual laugh. Across the entire episode, I laughed once at a misogynistic gag, and I'm ashamed of myself. And if you take away my shame, I didn't laugh once. I'm not perfect. I'm not that woke, obviously, because I laughed at Joan Collins being called a stupid cow. It came out of nowhere. Yeah.
Well, no, because you know what it is? It's that sort of, no pun intended, it's a punchy punchline.
Yes.
It's the kind of the vitriol of it.
Yes.
And it's the kind of thing that actually now, if you were doing a similar thing, one of the things that I thought this missed was it really needed some swearing at points. And now you would do a similar kind of joke, but it would be someone would just say, stupid cunt.
Yes.
Or fuck, it's like that kind of aggressive punch. And when you strip it back and think of it in terms of real people, it's not very pleasant. But in a sitcom setting, having that kind of sort of angry, aggressive moment, it just makes you splut. It makes you just laugh.
Yeah.
One of those can come out, the unexpected.
Yeah.
But at the sort of 25, 24 minute mark, it's not hitting very well.
No, it's not. There isn't that much left. I found Janice's character fundamentally unlikable, but she was supposed to be. Whereas I think some of the other characters weren't supposed to be as unpleasant as I think they came across as.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I think it's like Rupert Everett's character. I think he was meant to be a lovable idiot, but he's just tedious and superfluous.
Yes, exactly that. Whereas they at least got it right with Samantha Janice's character. I didn't even write the character's name down.
Well, this was the thing. She was called Sharon Emanuel.
Right.
And that name almost encapsulates the issue that I had with her. So she's brilliant in it. I think she's really good. Over the years, I've reevaluated her as an actor, because back in the day, I always felt like she was the sort of the current comedy blonde. She would turn up in things playing comedy blondes like this. But actually, now I sort of look back, it's like she did a lot more than this. She was in more things than you realise, and she's a lot better and is a much better actor than I think I realised at the time. And she's quite fun in this. Yeah. There's another weird accent going on.
Yes.
I can't tell whether she's meant to be British who's been to America, because she starts out quite RP, and then she has some sort of transatlantic kind of years going on near the end. So I don't know what that is.
No.
But there's something about her character that I found deeply unpleasant, in the way that, weirdly, I feel like only I'm trying to think of the nice way to say this. It's like it's an angry woman's view of a bad woman.
Yeah, probably fair.
Again, like I say, I kind of like Ruby Wax, but she's quite an old wave feminist. And in the 80s and 90s, she produced some really cool work as a feminist. But then looking back on this, it's kind of like, that's not a very pleasant depiction of a woman. It's like, what's wrong with Samantha Janice's character here? It's like, well, she's blonde and she's sexy and she's young, and we've given her a slutty name. We've called her Sharon, which makes her sound common. Her second name's Emmanuel, which is the softcore porn. It's like, and what does she do? She just sits there and slags off Joan Collins for being old. There's no character there other than being annoyingly young and pretty.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think it's so shallow. And I think that it does kind of show a certain attitude of that wave of feminism.
Yeah.
This sort of slightly aggressive resentment of youth.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Also, maybe a little bit, it's quite an American, I don't know, maybe getting too deep into it, but obviously Ruby Wax is American, and some of the sensibilities in this do feel a little bit more American in what what she's sort of like poking at. But yeah, I found the Janice's character just a deeply unpleasant foil. Yeah. She could have been a likable bimbo. She could have been an intelligent young woman. She could have been any other kind of thing to trigger Joan Collins, but she's basically just a shitty, dumb blonde. And it's such a trope, and it's so empty.
I agree. And I have spent the last 40 minutes slagging this television program off, but the last 3 minutes genuinely surprised me. Some real fucking bravery from Joan Collins, who is supposed to be the image that we saw around the 20-minute mark, and a real message, and a really feminist message. And I loved it that she laid down the smack, and the message at the end was really, really strong and really, really powerful, actually. A proper feminist ending. And I was so impressed, and I wasn't expecting it. And it was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
I think that last almost final moments, because obviously there's the final moment.
We'll come back to that.
Those almost final moments, you're absolutely right. They're really strong. And again, it's this idea of having the icon that is Joan Collins and then stripping that back. And you can absolutely see that scene, that kind of like clapping back at Samantha Janice's character. You can absolutely see that scene. Right. Okay. So this is the starting point of the full series. This is where she is. The pilot is over. This is what we're going to be going forward. The problem I have with that whole scene, and I agree with everything you say about how strong it is and how powerful it is, and it does have this kind of like strong feminist bent to it. The problem is that the rest of the episode hasn't earned that, or the rest of the episode hasn't led us towards that. I've not seen her go on a journey that really has brought her to that point.
Fully agree.
And the Samantha Janice character that, I was just sort of slagging off how unpleasant I found it. I think the real problem is that she's almost a straw man character, just to allow Collins to have this sort of big, powerful, again, middle-aged feminist moment. It's kind of like reclaiming, I am who I am, and I've lived my life, and my wrinkles are my own, which is a great moment and a great stance to take for starting a sitcom, for exploring a character. The problem is we've not really got there, and in the last few moments before that, we've had this really ugly, cheap characterization of the dumb blonde who is just like picking at her to trigger that. Nothing leads us there. Nothing really leads us to that moment, other than maybe Samantha Janice, who talks for like 90 seconds.
I think that's fair. And I think the way I'd put it, it was marketed as a sitcom by the BBC. And as you watched it, it came across as a well-intentioned but not particularly well-done dramedy or drama comedy, whatever you want to call it. And this plot line should have been a drama.
Yeah, I think that's bang on the money. And that's what I said near the beginning. I watched this at the time. My memory of this was that it was like in my head, I thought it was a 50-minute comedy drama. A bit like the kind of stuff that Victoria Wood used to do, some of those, sort of like comedy dramas that she would do and that kind of thing. That's honestly, in my head, that's what this was. And it was only sort of like redigging through it a little bit that I was like, oh shit, it was actually just a sitcom pilot. And weirdly, going back to it and realizing that, I can't remember what my reaction was back in 1993. I remember not thinking it was that good and being a bit disappointed. And like I say, it went away, never came back. But going back to it now, I was a bit disappointed that it was so sitcom-y and therefore so bad.
Yeah.
Because I think if you go into this thinking this is a comedy drama, maybe you'll get more out of it. Maybe you'll enjoy it more. Not a lot more, because I don't think it's very well scripted. I don't think it's very well written. I do think it's quite well directed, though.
Well, there we go. And that's why we were here, technically. And that is the end of the episode of Mama's Back. Nothing else happens after the really powerful moment with Joan Collins reclaiming her femininity. There is definitely not a shitty gag about blindness and Winnie Mandela at the end that fucking ruins it. There's definitely not that. Ugh.
It's such a weird double whammy, isn't it?
I spat out my tea.
Honestly, it's like the scene where we first meet this blind woman was a terrible scene anyway.
Yep.
It's a terrible scene and it's not funny.
Nope.
It's a bit like earlier when Everett they talk about Winnie Mandela and Everett's just kind of like, oh, she's black. It's like, okay, as an audience, we know that. If you're trying to make a joke here, you don't need to tell us that. And when this blind woman turns up and, I mean, the dialogue around it is just weird and ugly, but also, why is she there? It's like there's no context given to who this woman is or why she has the access to the area that she's in, what she's doing there. She's only there so they can set up this closing gag.
Yeah. And it feels like they really did achieve something with that scene, with taking the makeup off and everything by Joan Collins. Not only a statement of feminism, but also getting Joan Collins to do it. That's a big deal. And then what they did was they climbed to the top of a gigantic scaffolding and did a diuretic shite all over it. It really made me angry. Like, actually angry that they seemed to want to ruin it with an unfunny, crass, just unpleasant joke at the end.
It's such an unpleasant... And again, this is what I said about the opening scene and the closing scene being in different sitcoms.
Yes.
So there's a surrealness, there's a silliness. The idea that Joan Collins has come out of this situation now so empowered that she can make a blind person see. If the whole sitcom had been surreal, if the whole sitcom had that slight hyper reality, and actually, if we hadn't seen this woman before, if we hadn't seen her before, if they hadn't had the weird clunky setup, and Joan Collins had just walked out, touched a woman, and she'd gone, I can see, and they had maybe someone else, maybe, I don't know. If they'd done like the rule of three, if she'd come out and touched someone in a wheelchair and they got up and said, I can walk. Someone who is blind, I can see. So, something else. In that, almost that kind of like Mel Brooks kind of way. The kind of like the real extreme silliness of it. Then they might have got away with it. But they don't get away with it because it's just a weirdly, slightly gross joke that had been so poorly set up.
Yeah. Tasteless. And I think had it not had that gag at the end, with the ending being the strong statement of feminism, that it could have got away with being just about okay. Yes. But it isn't, it's crap. And that's a real sadness.
Yeah, because it leaves you with a stinker.
Yeah, it does. Dear. I do get myself into some scrapes with these specials. Did you enjoy the experience of watching it back? Because I didn't see it at all when I was a kid. This is the first I heard of it was when I was reading one of the Smegazines for the podcast. So, how do you feel going back to it, Rob?
You know what? Like completely neutral. It's like when you got in touch and said, "Did I want to talk about it?" I hadn't thought about it for 30 years, but as soon as I saw Mama's Back, my brain went, oh, no way. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Because, of course, with the You Have Been Watching podcast, it's very much in my remit. Like old, slightly obscure sitcom-y stuff. And I was like, yeah, definitely. I remember that. And then I went back to it and watched it, and I was just like, oh, it's not good.
No.
I didn't think it was good. My memory of it was not being good. My memory of it was it being a bit of a clunky project. But then I watched it again. It's just like, it's not even so bad it's good. It's not even a product of its time. It's just really poor. And I watched it a second time, watched it again last night just before this, to make some notes. And the second time watching it, I was so passive to it.
Right.
Like I wasn't even irritated or offended. Watching it back both times, I didn't laugh once. Didn't get a laugh out of me at all.
It got one laugh out of me that I retract in shame. But yeah, I just feel like this was a miss. But like I say, I'm not great on directing. Do you feel like it was directed well with what he had of a bad script?
No, I think it was actually really nicely directed, especially because Ed By at the time was doing a lot of studio sitcom. In fact, going back through the time, when I was 13, I think it was, and this came out, I will have watched it mostly because it was Ed By.
Right.
Because I was a big fan of Ed By. And I was a bit of a fan of Ruby Wax. Like I say, I liked her earlier sketch stuff, Girls on Top, that she did with French and Saunders and that kind of thing. Her own stuff that she did, her own sketch show, was always a bit more choppy. But Ed By, I was a big fan of Ed By, especially by that point in my early teens. So for me, I think I watched this, because Ed By did it. And I think it's really good. It's nicely shot. It's nicely made. It does look more expensive than a sitcom.
Yeah.
Because most of the money will have gone on Collins.
It's true.
Gambon is Michael Gambon, but he'll do anything for like, a fiver and a pint. So it's like, they've got a good cast there. And it did look really nice. And I think with the exception of the faces sequence, which is really clunky and goes on too long, I think it is nicely directed. I think the pacing is not great, but I think that is entirely down to the script.
I agree.
I think the directing matches the pacing. I don't think that it works against it. So no, I do think it's quite nicely done. There's some really nice, it sounds like I'm sort of complimenting the lighting at a friend's theatre show when it was bad, but there's some really nice establishing shots. Some of the intimacy of the character stuff is really good. And yeah, it's always seemed strange to me that Ed By didn't end up doing more drama or comedy drama.
Right. I've had a nice time regardless. I hope you have as well, Rob. And for people who want to tune into You Have Been Watching, where are they looking?
The best place to find us is via Twitter, where we are YHBW Pod. So all our new weekly and fortnightly episodes, they all get promoted out there. But if you just type You Have Been Watching a British Sitcom Podcast into your favourite podcast platform, whether it's Apple or Spreaker or whatever the hell it is, you'll be able to find us. And we've got a nice back catalogue of chit-chat about all kinds of random British sitcoms there.
So thank you for listening to another episode of Shipwrecked and Comatose. We've got more weird shit headed your way, I think. But we have got Series 11 as well. So keep your eye on our socials at Red Dwarf Pod for more information on what's coming up soon. And until next time,
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast, was created and produced by Mark Adams and Kurt North. You can find us on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, and we are part of the We Made This Podcast network.
Hello everyone, I'm Robert Turnbull, producer and co-host of You Have Been Watching, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of British sitcom. I and my co-host Alex Lynch take you on a journey through the weird and wonderful world of British sitcoms, looking at a range of different subjects and different shows, including classics like Fawlty Towers. In the same way as David Brent and Alan Partridge and Victor Meldrew, Basil works best for me when he is actually dealing with arseholes. The more forgotten oddities like The Asylum.
I don't know if I was necessarily a fan of it. It was a bit kind of... If I'd seen that on the Paramount Comedy Channel when I hadn't known who any of these people were, I probably wouldn't have necessarily enjoyed it.
And we even have top 10s like favourite sitcom theme tunes, or episodes dedicated to a subject like the quirk of recasting in sitcoms. Weirdly, I feel like the examples that I've been able to find of like properly recasting characters, like bringing new actors in to play the same characters, they tend to be bad sitcoms that didn't last very long. So do please come and give us a listen on the We Made This network. We're available on all podcast platforms and on Twitter at YHBWPod. So come and give us a follow, give us a listen, send us a comment, and let's all have a laugh.